Forum Borealis Paradigm Expansion.
Greetings from the north, citizens of the world. Welcome to Forum Borealis. Tonight we have another program in our Polar Mysteries series, though it could also belong to our Esoteric Philosophy series. You know, the word Borealis comes from Latin and means northern. From Boreas, meaning north wind, which in turn is from Greek, where Boreas is the name of the god of the north wind, which is of unknown origin, perhaps related to words in Sanskrit, giri, and Balto-Slavic gire, or as in Old Church Slavonic gora, for mountain, also forest, as if those living beyond the mountains. Hyperborea, in turn, means beyond the north or from the extreme north of the earth, from Greek hyperboreos, pertaining to the regions of the far north. In ancient times, the Hyperboreans were reckoned as a tribe or a nation, as the Hyperboreoi were an alleged northern people believed by the ancients to be distinguished by piety and happiness, their land being beyond, hence out of reach of, the north wind. It was thought to be a blissful paradise. Closely related to this is Thule, which was a region or island at northernmost part of the world, from Greek Thule, meaning land 6 days' sail north of Britain. As Strabo put it, quoting a lost portion of a work by Polybius, itself based on a lost account of a voyage to the north by the 4th century BC geographer Pytheos. The identity of the place and the source of the name have sparked much speculation, and since Roman times the name has been used in a transferred sense of extreme limits of travel, or Ultima Thule. According to Pytheos, the barbarians showed us where the sun set, for it happened in those places that the night was extremely short, lasting only 2 or 3 hours, and the sun sunk under the horizon after a short interval reappeared at his rising. Now, one of the classic works on this subject is Professor Goodwin's scholarly treatment of polar legends, catastrophes, occult lore, the golden age, imperishable sacred land, the hidden lands, Arcadia regained, the symbolic pole, polar and solar traditions, the spiritual pole, the northern lights, the Arctic homeland, the Aryan myth, UFOs, the hollow earth, the hidden kingdom of Agartha and Shambala, and much more. This enthralling book is called Arctos, the polar myth in science, symbolism, and Nazi survival. It has stood almost alone since it was published in 1996, that is, until now. Finally, another worthy publication, a sequence, if you will, of this subject is out, and by none other than one of Goodwin's friends and colleagues, namely the emeritus Christopher McIntosh. In his book, Beyond the North Wind, The Fall and Rise of the Mystic North, he examines how the North is simultaneously a location, a direction, and a mystical concept. Although this concept has ancient roots in mythology, folklore, and fairy tales, it continues to resonate today within modern culture. McIntosh leads the reader through the magical and spiritual history of the North, as well as its modern manifestations, as documented through physical records, such as rune stones and megaliths, but also through mythology and lore. This mythic conception of a unique, powerful and mysterious northern civilization was known to the ancients and considered to be the true origin place of their god Apollo, bringer of civilization. Through the Greeks, this concept of the mythic north would spread throughout Western civilization. Further, he discusses Russian neo-Hyperboreanism, which he describes as among the most influential of the new religions and quasi-religious movements that have sprung up in Russia since the fall of communism, and which is currently almost unknown in the West. And so, we are fortunate to have this distinguished academic author of many esoteric works on as a guest. Dr. Christopher McIntosh is a writer, historian, and translator, specializing in the esoteric traditions of the West. He was born at autumn equinox in England in 1943 and grew up in Edinburgh, Scotland, where he first attended the Edinburgh Academy. He then studied philosophy, politics and economics at Oxford University, then took a degree in German at London University, later returning to Oxford to take a doctorate in history, with a dissertation on the Rosicrucian revival. This has since been published as a book. He also has a diploma in Russian from the United Nations Language School. After working in London in journalism and publishing, McIntosh spent 4 years in New York as an information officer with the United Nations Development Programme, then moved to Germany to work for UNESCO in Hamburg. In parallel, he has traveled throughout the world, as well as achieved a career as a writer and researcher specializing in the esoteric traditions as well as paganism. Indeed, he has had a lifelong interest in nature-oriented belief systems, and also involved himself at a personal basis with small circles within such traditions. He's published both fiction and non-fiction, and we're going to review a few of those titles today. Christopher McIntosh has lectured widely and was for several years on the faculty of the Centre for the Study of Esotericism at Exeter University, a legendary distance MA program in Western esotericism in England, organized by Dr. Nicholas Goodrick Clark, but now sadly discontinued. Incidentally, we have talked with a colleague of his from those days, Tobias Churton, who goes a little more into that laudable project in our show with him. Another noteworthy venture where he has been a frequent speaker is the Esoteric Quest conferences organized by Ralph White and the New York Open Center. Chris McIntosh has naturally been interviewed by and featured in many documentaries and TV programs like The New Age and The New Man, and also several journals like Gnosis magazine and websites like pansoffers.com, and of course radio shows and podcasts like Spybrary, Spy Podcast and The Higher Side Chats. Christopher is married to the German scholar of religion Dr. Donate Panke McIntosh, who runs the Selen Institute for Rituals, where they reside in Bremen, Lower Saxony in North Germany. Together they have the website vanadis.org, and in addition Chris runs his own website osgard.net. That's Osgard with a Z. Enjoy. Welcome to Forum Borealis, Chris.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Such a pleasure to have you, an honor actually, because as I've told you offline, I have been an avid reader of you for many, many years, because obviously you're one of the cornerstones of academic esoterica, I think we should say, on the line with Jocelyn Godwin and also your friend Tobias Churton that we've had on before.
Oh, yes.
And we'll have him back. Now, I have to tell you that I've been fascinated about the topic of the polar myths. And indeed, one of the first shows I wanted to do when we started was with your colleague Jocelyn Godwin that I mentioned, and his book Arctos, that you obviously are familiar with.
Yes.
And I mean, I love that book. And unfortunately, he doesn't give interviews anymore. He had just stopped right before we asked. So, and the years went, we actually covered Antarctica in a show. And bam, here you come. And you launch a fresh book on a similar topic, at least, called Beyond the North Wind, The Fall and Rise of the Mystic North. Very intriguing. So this made, of course, a great reason to get you on. And I guess my first question is, why would you want to write about this topic?
Well, when I was going to school back in the 1950s and 60s, the version of history we were taught was basically that civilization, or Western civilization at least, spread from south to north. So it all began roughly in the region that is now Iraq, and then went via the Egyptians and the Greeks and the Romans and further north. And a key moment was when Europe was Christianized, and since then we've never looked back. That was the picture that we were given. So the early inhabitants of northern Europe tended to be written off as primitive barbarians. And one of the few things I remember being taught about the ancient Britons, was that they dyed their skins blue with a substance called woad.
Yeah, I saw that in, the cartoon Asterix.
Ah, yes, yes. So I used to imagine these mysterious blue-skinned figures moving through the mist-laden forests of ancient Britain and occasionally grunting to each other in what passed for language. Well, we now know that that picture was completely false. We now know that there was an advanced civilization in northern Europe long before the Romans or even the Egyptians or the Egyptian civilization existed.
Hang on, how far back are we estimating this?
Oh, we're going back to at least 4000 BC.
Jeez. Because I've been fascinated by, I've read about, and you may know this, I've read about the original inhabitants of the British Isles, or at least in Scotland, at the end of Scotland, there used to be more land there. And I'm not even referring to so-called Doggerland that's in between, but and there is some myths about ancient people who lived there before.
Oh yes. Well, there were the Picts, and we know very little about the Picts, but they've left behind some very interesting remains, which indicated that they also had an advanced culture.
When do we estimate that the Picts lived?
I'm afraid I can't give you an exact date, but they were still around when the Romans came, which would have been 1st century BC. But talking about Scotland, there was some very interesting remains discovered in eastern Scotland. These were stone spheres about the size of a tennis ball, which were shaped in such a way as to represent the Platonic solids. These are the solid geometric shapes that Plato describes in the Timaeus. The tetrahedron, cube, octahedron, and so on. Now, the interesting thing is that Plato's Timaeus dates, I think, from around, I'm not sure exactly, but 500-600 BC.
Yeah,
Whereas,
I think maybe 400.
400.
Yeah, because Pythagoras lived 500 and he was a predecessor.
Oh, right. Well, but these stone spheres date back to about 3,000 or 4,000.
Jeez.
3,000 or 4,000 BC. So that means that there was a civilization at that time which knew about the Platonic solids. So that gives you an idea of how false the picture was of the ancient Britons.
Yeah, obviously Plato can't have invented it out of thin air. He must have been privy to some ancient tradition,
Well, exactly.
This indicates, right? And this indicates that there may have been commonalities between real ancient traditions in the East and the West.
Yes, this is one of the indirect pieces of evidence that there was some kind of precursor civilization in the north. We also have things like the Viking ships, those beautiful streamlined ships that you see in, for example, the Viking Museum in Oslo, like the Oseberg ship. Now, the curator of that museum has said that it would take thousands of years of trial and error to come up with a design like that. So the question is where that technology came from.
Yeah, because obviously the Viking era didn't even last 1,000 years. So
No.
they must have inherited, they must have been a culmination of some kind of tradition or evolution going on there.
Yes.
Or maybe a devolution.
Yes, absolutely, yes.
And I agree with you, because we also know now that even as recent, in this perspective, recently back as the Vikings, we've got stuff so wrong. And there is this revival interest in Vikings now. We have this show on a series going, and okay, it's not as bad as Vikings having horn on a helmet. Okay, we moved away from there, but there's so many things people don't know. For example, the Vikings, they look at them as you call them in your book. You call them the samurai of the West.
Yes,
that's a pretty good expression. But
Yes.
they were into fashion. Actually, they put great pride in how they dressed themselves. They were snobs, I'd say, and they had refined cultural aspects that are lost, that we are not so aware of now. But we'll discuss that later. I want to track even further back, because the stuff you've been saying now indicates what's popularly called an antediluvian civilization, and obviously we have the expression Hyperborea that we got from the Greeks.
Yes.
And you touch upon this in your book, don't you?
Yes, yes, I do. The notion of Hyperborea goes back to a Greek mariner called Pythias, who set sail from the Greek colony of Massalia, which is present-day Marseille, and sailed out through the Strait of Gibraltar into the Atlantic and then up into the north. And he came to a land which he describes as a land of ice and fog, which may have been Iceland. We're not absolutely sure, but it sounds as though it must have been Iceland.
Going from today's geography.
Yes. Yeah.
But stuff may have been different back then.
Well, possibly, yes. But at any rate, Pythias's account of this place, he called it Thule, or the Romans called it Ultima Thule. And this notion of Thule gathered a mystique about it. Another name for it was Hyperborea, meaning the land beyond the north, the land beyond Boreas, the north wind. So,
how long do you estimate it would take for them to sail from Greece to Iceland? Do you have any notion about that?
No, it's difficult for me to answer that question. I would imagine several weeks.
Okay, because according to... I looked up the etymology of Thule, because Borea is simple. That means, like you say, ultimate north.
Yes.
The ultimate Thule, they are disputing the origin. They think it means the end, related to telos.
Oh, yes.
Or the most remote land. But there is a reference that the Brits, that it's they call it that it took 6 days from the British Isles to get there.
Really?
And then I'm thinking, does it take 6 days to sail to Iceland? I don't think so. I think that would be done in probably a couple of days, depending on the technology, of course.
Yes. Yes, so that indicates that it must have been further north than Iceland.
Mm.
Yes, that's interesting.
So what do we do? How do we have other clues that there may have been habitable areas? I mean, just a so simple thing as Greenland.
Yeah.
We know it was green because it was before the Little Ice Age, and the Vikings could even do agriculture there, and today that's not possible. But back in the day, there may even have been lost lands. So are you touching this in your book?
Yes, yes, I do. We know that there have been climatic changes in the far north. For example, there's been vegetation found in the north of Canada, in places like the Faroe Islands and Spitsbergen, which indicate that at one time there was a mild temperate climate in those places. There are various reasons why that might have been the case. One theory that Jocelyn Godwin describes in his book Archetypes is that at one time the Earth's axis may have been vertical, which would have meant that there would have been no change of seasons, and the temperate zone would have reached much further north than it does now. So that's one indication that the conditions may have been suitable for a civilization in the north.
But if there has been a dramatic tilt, then we can also assume that there may have been land masses further north that have now sunken. Otherwise, we'll have to look to, like you say, Spitsbergen.
Yes.
Up in our neck of the woods. Or maybe Greenland, or the very northern parts of Russia and Canada. But indeed, a tilt is such a dramatic...
Well, it is, yes. Yes, there are other possible ways to account for the climatic change. Mm-hmm. If you think of the Earth's surface as the shell of an egg, which can slide back and forth, it's possible that the surface of the Earth has slid at one point. So these places were further south. It's also possible to account for it by warm currents like the Gulf Stream,
right,
which may have had a different flow at that time. But you mention northern Russia as a possible location for this early civilization. And this is another thing that I've gone into in the book, because there have been some fascinating discoveries made in the northern part of Russia next to the Arctic Ocean. There have been several expeditions there. One expedition took place in the 1920s. It was led by a man called Barchenko, who went to the Kola Peninsula, right up there in the north on the Arctic Ocean. And he found all kinds of things like paved roads, pyramids, stone pyramids, wow. A huge throne carved out of a solid block of stone, and all kinds of other things, which indicate that there must have been a culture in that region with great technical capacities. The strange thing is that there don't seem to have been any human remains discovered from that period. The only remains that have been found indicate a rather primitive kind of hunter-gatherer kind of people.
Yeah, but would we expect human remains to last for thousands of years?
Well, in other parts of the world they have. And after all, there are remains of mammoths. So that's a bit of a puzzle, and unless there was a population unless there was a mass exodus that took place.
Right. Or like in Göbekli Tepe, they say people didn't live there. They say it was a ceremonial place where they gathered regularly.
Yes,
This place sounds like it could be something like that too.
Yes.
If it has pyramids and thrones, it doesn't sound so practical. I don't think they were doing agriculture there.
No. Well, the Barchenko expedition made contact with the local Sami people in that region. And the Sami people had a particular island that was located in the White Sea, or in a lake in the middle of the Kola Peninsula. And this was a sacred place for the Samis where they used to bury their dead. And they had a particular cult of the reindeer. And this island was covered with reindeer horns. And no one was allowed to go there without special permission. And the Sami had all kinds of beliefs and practices which led Barchenko to conclude that they were the original Hyperboreans. So he was convinced...
Or the descendants of them.
Or the descendants, yes. So he was convinced that he had in fact found Hyperborea. But... it's very difficult to say where Hyperborea might have been located. There are other candidates for the possible location.
Yeah, it sounds to me he's going in the same trap as the Atlantis researchers. They find signs of very ancient, and then I think this is the place. Right. But then they discard the fact that if it was somewhat advanced civilization, you wouldn't expect it to be just a town at a certain place. It would probably be spread in a larger area.
Yes.
So I think maybe this is a track. But what does the myths of the Inuits and Samis say? Do they have any... What's the ancient myths in these areas?
Well, the interesting thing is that all the indigenous people around the pole, around the Arctic Circle, have a shamanic culture. From the Inuit, from Greenland all the way around to Alaska, then the various Mongol peoples of Russia, the Buryat and the what's the other Sami people? The other anyway.
You mean Eskimos?
No, I mean the Yakut.
Right.
The Yakut and the Buryat and then the Sami in northern Scandinavia. All the way around the Arctic Circle were shamanic peoples, sharing a shamanic culture. So this is extremely interesting.
Indeed. I mean, there are other land masses that hasn't been excavated, like Yuzhny Island, Svalbard, Samlia, and all around the Barents Sea. So I wouldn't be surprised if we ever digged at these areas, stuff would pop up. But they're not even digging in areas where we know there is stuff. There's no interest and money for it. So
no. Well,
it's just like by accident they discover something.
Yes. Well, but there seems to have been human habitation in that region of northern Russia, going back, I think, as far as 40,000 years BC, because they found, for example, a mammoth which had wounds on it that indicated that it had been hunted with a spear or some sharp.
What was this mammoth frozen in the ice since?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And that also indicates a dramatic climate change.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
So even if the Earth didn't tilt, or if the land masses didn't move, it would be habitable within the current structure of the geography.
Yes. It's not a very hospitable climate, but it is habitable.
So have you found other circumstantial evidence pointing to an ancient lost civilization in the far north? I think you mentioned something in another interview about Svalbard.
I don't recall.
Me neither. But you said something interesting about Svalbard. What was it?
I don't recall that.
Yes, or was it about the language or scriptures?
Yes. Well, there was an English researcher called J.G. Bennett. He's actually better known as a proponent of the Gurdjieff movement. But
Bennett, yes, he's famous.
J.G. Bennett, yes. Well, he wrote a very interesting essay about a theory that to do with language. And what he says basically is, if you look at the European language, the Indo-European language, and the languages that are descended from it, they're extremely complicated. If you look, for example, at a language like Russian, it has 6 cases, it has enormously complex verb forms, complex grammatical rules. And Bennett's argument is basically a language of that complexity couldn't just have evolved by trial and error. It had to have been invented by a group of people. And he says the ideal conditions to invent such a language would be when you had a community of people who were cut off from the rest of the world, and for a certain period. And so he believes that this took place in the Arctic region at a time when it was cut off. There was a kind of oasis, a kind of temperate oasis in the midst of the ice, cut off by a kind of ice barrier. And then at a certain point, the ice retreated, and these people were able to migrate out of the north and dispersed. So I can see that argument.
Yeah, often one uses linguistics in order to back up archaeology and anthropology and other stuff. So that's totally legitimate. Yeah. But of course, we could take it much further down the rabbit hole and introduce an alternative explanation, namely the hollow earth.
Oh, yes.
Which is kind of a fun, at least I think it's a more advanced theory than the flat earth.
Yes.
At least it acknowledges basic astronomical facts. Yeah. Now, I've had actually a physician as a guest who argues for the hollow earth. It has been a myth dominated by nutcases and religious people, but there are even scientific indications that could back up such. For example, 2 Japanese scientists have discovered, and this made shockwaves in the scientific community, that there is underneath our sea, the sea ground, underneath the earth, there is more oceans than above the surface of the earth.
Really?
Yes, and that's very weird. And they try, of course, they have to explain it within the current paradigm, right? So they're not jumping to hollow earth, but there are many tidbits like this that one could entertain if one really wanted to be good-willed.
Yes.
So do you touch the hollow earth explanation in your book?
No, I don't. No.
Okay. But to give them their due, so they say if you go beyond the fog and the ice, it starts getting warmer.
Yes.
And you have an observation of this. I don't know if you mentioned that in the book, people who have observed warm zones at the poles.
No, but all that is very fascinating.
Indeed.
And of course it crops up in literature, like in Edward Bulwer-Lytton's novel, The Coming Race.
Real, yes, real.
Real, yes. Yeah. And in Jules Verne's story, The Journey to the Center of the Earth. Yes, I did mention that actually in my book, Journey to the Center of the Earth.
Oh, okay. And notwithstanding he's from my hometown, Ludwig Holberg. People think he was Danish, but he wrote about Niels Klim's journeys to the, I think it's the center of the earth or the inner earth. for some reason there was a lot of books in literature dealing with this topic. So it has been an old tradition going far, far back that has been kept alive. And if we take it seriously, then they claim, I mean, one thing is to imagine that the earth is hollow. I guess you could make a case for that if you consider some anomaly in science. But another thing is to claim that you can go through the holes. And there are people living there, and that's when we really go into the rabbit hole, and we could invoke there, of course, Nazi lore, neo-Nazi lore about this, and also in Tibet and stuff like that. So well,
then,
yeah.
Then there's the whole myth of Agartha,
right,
which is also supposed to be an underground civilization. And in fact, if you go on the internet and Google Agartha, you'll find that there are people who still believe that Agartha exists.
Yes, and Shambala is another.
And Shambala, yes.
Yeah. Nicholas Roerich was looking for Shambala.
Yes.
As was Blavatsky, Gurdjieff.
Yes, yes. Well, the whole...
And I think Lama Govinda
the whole Shambala story is very fascinating. This is... One of the things that has always fascinated me is the interface between history and myth. The way that history turns into myth, and myth often drives history. And the whole Shambhala story is an example of myth driving history. Because, as you say, there was the Roerich expedition, and the Bolsheviks used the Shambhala myth to try to gain hegemony over Central Asia. It was part of the whole great game, the struggle between Russia and Britain for control of that region. Wow. So, and Roerich, well, the whole story of Roerich is extremely interesting.
Indeed, this explains maybe why the Bolsheviks offered to Roerich to become cultural minister right after the revolution. I mean, this was obviously before the Stalinist period. This was when everything was new and fresh and nothing was shaped yet. But he found them to be too vulgar, so he declined the offer. But then I see what usage they would have of him, because if they were pushing that myth, he would be a great, because he was a famous explorer already back in the day. Yes. Interesting. And do we know other archaeological anomalies indicating, or scientific anomalies indicating an advanced civilization in the north?
Well, there's a very interesting book by an Italian researcher, Vinci, I forget his first name, who wrote a very interesting book called The Baltic Origins of Homer's Epic Tales. And he claims in that book that the places described in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey weren't located around the Mediterranean, but around the Baltic Sea. And he comes up with some very interesting evidence for this. That, for example, from linguistics, like the name for the Aegean Sea comes from the Nordic god Aegir, the sea god. And there are other pieces of evidence, like in Homer, the Peloponnese is described as a flat island, when in fact we know that it was a mountainous peninsula. And there's an island in the Baltic which exactly corresponds to Homer's description. And the way that Homer's characters, the way they dress, the food they eat, and so on, it all corresponds to the Baltic region and not to the Mediterranean.
That's interesting, but Homer is believed to have taken place in Greece. Is that a traditional interpretation?
Well, what Vinci argues is that there was a civilization around the Baltic and Scandinavia, which at some point migrated to the Mediterranean region and Greece, taking with them an ancient epic tradition.
Ah.
You see?
Yeah.
So Homer was just picking up on this much earlier tradition.
This is interesting because this would be disagreement, an alternative explanation to Dr. Peter Kingsley's take.
Yes.
Because I believe he describes the same ancient seafaring people, but I think he argues that they come from Central Asia.
Yes.
Altai.
Yes.
But still they agree in one fact, and that they come from the north.
Yes, yes, yes.
And Kingsley also argues that the shamanism aspect that you touch.
Yes.
And
yes.
He says that Abaris.
Yes, Abaris the Hyperborean. Yes.
Exactly. And he was said to have met, for example, Pythagoras. He gave him a gift.
Yes, yes.
The arrow.
Yes.
And he thinks that's related to the people called Avaris,
yes.
which is an interesting suggestion.
Yes, it is.
Avarians.
Yes, yes. And then there's the theory of Tilak, the Indian writer, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, who wrote an interesting book called I think it's called The Aryan Home in the Vedas, and he came up with evidence from the Vedic texts, which seems to confirm the idea that there was this primal homeland in the far north. I mean, for example, he describes how in the Vedas there's mention of a place with a dawn of many days, which appears to refer to the fact that at the North Pole, in the North Pole region, there's basically a year is basically a day and a night. So you have...
that's right. If you go north of the polar circle, they have... it's famous in our country because people living up there go crazy.
Yes, absolutely.
6 months of daylight, 6 months of darkness.
Yes. Well, Tilak claims that this was the original home of the people that he calls the Aryans, who then migrated to India and wrote the Vedic texts.
But isn't it mainstream now that, I mean, the reason the language is called Indo-European is precisely the connection. We know there's connection in mythology and religion.
Yeah. Yes.
And genetically, I even think that, I mean, India is full of ethnicities, but the original Veda Indians are connected to the Scandinavians. And so, but the traditional, I think, interpretation is that the Scandinavians emigrated out of India to the West. But then you have, of course, you know about Thor Heyerdahl, right?
Yes, indeed, yes.
Yes, he claims that we originated around the Black Sea.
Yes.
Maybe not originated, but at some point Odin was an actual figure who emigrated.
Oh, yes, yes. Yes, indeed.
Do you touch this?
Well, this is what Snorri thought, actually. Snorri Sturluson, who wrote down the Edda, wrote the prose Edda. He believed that Odin was a historic figure who became mythologized. But I think I tend to think that Thor Heyerdahl was right, that the Indo-Europeans emerged somewhere in the region between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, several thousand years BC, and then migrated in two directions. One group went west and the other went east to India. So I think that's a more likely scenario than that they originated in India and then went west.
Yeah, but what if we acknowledge the possibility of an antediluvian northern civilization? Then they could have had an exodus, like you suggested, for the Kola Peninsula.
Yes.
And they may have gone to that area of Caucasian area between Caspian and Black Sea, and then split east and west.
Yes, that's possible. Yes.
So this also, of course, touches upon the rune phenomenon, because I believe that traditional tale is that Odin observed the sacred language and tools of the other tribes, like the hieroglyphs and also the Hebrew system, and he felt that Yeah, what's the story? Do you know that story there?
Oh, yes. Well, it's a kind of the description of how Odin received the secrets of the runes is a typical shamanic ordeal. So this is one of the things that makes me think that shamanism was in fact the original religion of the north. So this is described in the Edda, how Odin hung for 9 days and nights on the world tree, the Yggdrasil, and as a result of this, he obtained the secrets of the runes. So, but the runes, there are a number of mysterious things about the runes. The first inscriptions using the runic alphabet as we know it today date from around the 2nd century AD. So they appear to have been invented around that time. It's an extremely subtle and sophisticated system with all kinds of interesting internal patterns and mathematical patterns. So it seems to me that it was invented by a group of people, perhaps a group of priests of the old Nordic religion, and then it spread enormously rapidly throughout Northern Europe. Then several centuries later, I think around the 9th century AD, another version of the runes was invented. The first, the runic alphabet is called the Futhark, after the first 3 letters in the alphabet, and there was the elder Futhark, which consisted of 24 letters, and then the younger Futhark had only 16. And it's a bit of a mystery why the younger Futhark was invented, because in order to reduce it to 16, they had to make some letters stand for 2 different sounds.
That's not very practical.
It's not very practical. So it's a bit of a mystery why this younger Futhark was invented.
Could it just be that we don't have enough, that it's just fragments of a system? It's not complete in what we have today?
I think that's unlikely, because it does seem to have been used as a complete system.
But you also have the so-called Uthark.
Oh, the Uthark, yes. Well, that's the theory that there were. Well, you have to remind me exactly what it is.
Well, there are those who say that it should not begin with the F.
Right, yes.
Professor Agrell argues, in fact, that there was it Agrell who argued that? I have some old scriptures that say that there was really 25 letters, because there was one secret that they would not reveal.
Uh-huh.
And that makes it suddenly very resonating with the Greek alphabet, the Hebrew alphabet,
yes,
the hieroglyphs,
yes.
And then you can start seeing practical connections across these ancient systems, because what many people don't understand is that the ancient systems were not just alphabets. They were multi-layered tools. They were referring to ideas, magical practices, images, etc., etc. Sounds, obviously.
Right. Yes. The runes were a magical system and a system of divination,
which is very well known for today.
Yes.
So the runes, but you say the oldest religion, or you say that shamanism may be a remnant of the original Nordic religion.
Yes.
So do we think that the old Nordic religion was more coherent then and more advanced than these fragments that has been passed on to the northern cultures of more recent times?
Yes. Yes, I think it was a complete shamanic system, but at some point the shamanic elements got lost or fragmented, so that today we only have certain isolated hints, like, for example, the story of Odin and the runes, and a few other hints. I mean, like there is an old German text, the Merseburg spells, which describe what appears to be a shamanic. Well, it involves the healing of a horse with a broken leg, and the way this is described seems to indicate that it was a shamanic healing operation. So there are only very, very few these few hints, but I think that they do indicate that there was a shamanic culture in the north. And I mean there's evidence, for example, that Pythagoras was a kind of shaman, because his followers went in for things like trance journeys, shape changing, and so on, all things that are shamanic practices.
Yeah, Dr. Kingsley writes a lot about that.
Yes.
He makes such a solid case. I recommend everyone to check it out.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
And the incubation system, where you have to lay in, you travel to the worlds beneath.
Yes.
And above.
And I think also Pythagoras' mathematical discoveries may well have been arrived at in a shamanic altered state of consciousness.
Yeah, I happen to think it's a combination of deep personal insight, but also an heritage. And that's always the kind of the problem, that when you find similarities, like you mentioned the Platonic Solids or other ancient similarities that cannot be explained by the traditional logistics, if you will.
No.
Then you always have this polarity or dichotomy of either it's an inheritage, a physical inheritage, or it's an unveiling of archetypes.
Yes.
But I often say it can be both.
It can be both, yes, absolutely.
Like you get certain keys, and each generation explore them in different directions with different takes, but there will be similarities. Can we say that the runes have indications of being more than just a local system, or that they have indications of being older than what we tend to believe?
There's a researcher whom we both know, Halvard Harklau, who has done a very interesting analysis of the runes, mathematical analysis, and it's very complicated to describe, but it involves the fact that the runes are made up of 4 different kinds of stroke, or three different kinds: vertical, left-leaning, and right-leaning. And by dividing the runes into rows and counting the number of strokes in each row and so on, he arrived at some very interesting patterns. And one of the patterns he arrived at indicated a link to the Chinese Bagua system, which is similar to the I Ching, except it's using trigrams instead of hexagrams.
Right.
So he found that there was an exact correspondence between the runes and these trigrams, so which indicates that either that there was some influence from Scandinavia to Asia, or the other way around, or that there was some common source.
Yes, or that if they are tapping into the structures of existence, so to speak, like our default archetypal nature of things, then they will both uncover similar, if not identical, at least similar principles.
Yes, that's absolutely right. Yeah.
But again, it can be both.
Yes,
it can be both. We live in a very complex world, and I think he's onto it.
Yes.
So that's very interesting. Now, if and by the way, we even know that the Vikings actually had they found figures. They even found, I think, yin yang, but they found Asian.
Oh yes,
and Middle Eastern.
A Buddha figure.
Buddha figure, yes,
Yes,
for example.
yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they found Islamic symbolism too.
Well, I'm a bit skeptical about that, to be quite honest.
Okay.
Yeah, there was somebody in Norway who claimed that the sort of the embroidered borders on Viking, the dresses of Viking women, contained Arabic letters.
That's right.
Yeah, but I quite frankly, I'm very skeptical about that.
Well, again, it can be, uncovering patterns.
Well, possibly, yes.
Universal patterns, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, if you're going to embroider something, you'd be hard pressed not to accidentally touch an Arabian letter, because they are very embroidered.
Well, that's true.
By nature.
Yes.
No, all this is very interesting, but if we look at the more hard facts, the hard evidence rather than the soft, we obviously can't avoid megaliths and structures such as that. Now, many people think that stuff like Stonehenge were made by the Druids. What do you think about this?
Oh, I think that it goes back probably long before the Druids. Stonehenge is an amazing structure, and it must have required a culture with enormous technical capacities. I mean, it's been estimated that it would have taken the entire population of Britain at that time about 7 years.
Jeez.
Just to raise the central circle of stones.
Wow.
And how they got the stones there in the first place is a great mystery, because they're not local. The archaeologist Stuart Piggott, writing about Stonehenge, said, well, this is evidence of such an advanced culture that it must have come. It can't have been local. The technology must have been imported from the Mediterranean region. So he sort of fell into this habit of dismissing the ancient northern Europeans as primitive.
Right, but he's managed the feat to be right and wrong at the same time, because
Really?
Oh yeah, the reason is that he's right in that it's too advanced to just be something a few people in an area where they were not capable just threw up. That's okay. But then just because there is no paradigm for him to explain it otherwise, he automatically goes to the Middle East.
Yeah, well, or to the Mediterranean, yes.
Yeah, and that's just by default. There's no evidence. Okay, they have megaliths there too, but megalithic structures are universal, are they not? They're global.
Yes, they occur all over the world. There are some very interesting megaliths. For example, in the Orkney Islands.
The standing stones of the Orkney Islands. I've heard about that. Yeah.
Yes. I forget the name of the site now, but it's a most interesting site because it has two enclosures, a larger and a smaller one, and they appear to represent a maternal womb and a fetus, and they contain, for example, the golden section. The golden section. So what looks like a very simple structure is in fact contains all kinds of complex mathematical proportions.
Yeah, exactly. But that's the same for that's another argument for the Stonehenge too.
Indeed, yes.
The astronomical, it's too complex.
Yes.
To explain it within the traditional.
That's right. Yeah.
And you know René Schwaller de Lubitsch?
Yes.
He kind of made a good case for such complexities also in Egyptian structures.
Yes, he did.
So then you have, of course, Çatalhöyük or something.
Çatalhöyük, yes.
Yes, and Göbekli Tepe. Both of them debunk the notion that these were hunter-gatherers that just threw together a few stones. It's just too complex.
Too complex, yes.
Both in the way they erect it, like you say, where did the stone come from?
Yes.
But more interesting also in what they signify.
Yes, yes, yes.
And do you think that can be connected to the ancient religion?
Well, I think it probably is, yes.
So the priesthood were like scientists in a way.
Yeah.
And priests at the same
Yes.
time.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, yes.
Mm.
All of our files are free and will remain free. If you like the show, you can show support by donating $1 to help with expenses. Just use the PayPal link on our website, YouTube channel, or Facebook page. Thanks.
So let's go into the paganism. Are there any evidence or indications among the ancient and especially the Nordic paganism that points to an advanced origin?
Well, there are interesting correspondences between the Nordic paganism and, for example, the classical deities. Now, I think there's a strong case that the name Apollo is in fact cognate with Baldur, the northern sun god, because you only need to change. B and P are similar consonants, so you only need to change the B to a P, and R and along A sounds like an O, so it's not a great step from Baldur to Apollo. So I think that they are in fact the same god. And I mentioned earlier Aegir. So you have the Nordic sea god Aegir and the Aegean, the name Aegean. So yeah,
like in the Aegean Ocean.
Yes, right, exactly. Right. Someone we both know, Haraldur. He, when I told him I live near Bremen, he said that he thought that the name Bremen comes from the Nordic sea god Brimir. Yeah, so...
Right. I'm actually going to have Haraldur on to discuss, because he's been researching ancient Icelandic connections.
Yes.
So he has some groundbreaking theories there. Yeah, so that's interesting. But I know there have been similarities between Sami, Lapp traditions and ancient Norse religion, and the same I think can also be made a case for the Eskimos.
Oh yes.
So you touch this in your book?
Well, yeah, yes. I mean, one typical motif among all the shamanic peoples is the notion of the world tree. The tree at the center of the world. So sometimes it's a tent pole which becomes symbolically the center of the world, and so you get this all over the shamanic world, and you get it again in the Nordic mythology, the Yggdrasil. So this is another piece of evidence that the northern religion, the northern culture is basically shamanic.
What about the Ouroboros? Is that something going through as a universal theme?
Ouroboros, yes. Well, that crops up everywhere, doesn't it?
As a dragon or a snake?
Yes. I think it's a sort of multi-leveled symbol, the Ouroboros. It crops up a lot in alchemy, of course, as a symbol of the cyclical process, the cyclical transformation process that's going on all the time in the world of matter.
I haven't read your book, unfortunately. If I had, I would be able to direct the questions more specifically. But from the preview of the book, I see you are accounting for labyrinths. What's the connection there?
Oh, well, yes, that's another motif that I could have mentioned. Like the symbol of the world tree, the labyrinth. This you get this obviously in the story of the Cretan labyrinth. The Cretan labyrinth, where
the Minotaur.
Yes, where the Minotaur was kept in the labyrinth, and Theseus went into the labyrinth and killed the Minotaur and released all the prisoners. And then after that, they went to the island of Delos, and in celebration, they danced what was called the crane dance, which was a kind of dance that was performed in a labyrinthine pattern. Now, you get variations of this crane dance in many different places. There's for example, a dance that's performed in the Faroe Isles, which is
right,
which seems to be a variation of this crane dance, and I believe it's still danced in Greece.
Right.
So the labyrinth, again, you find the labyrinth. The labyrinths, by the way, they were found in Siberia, in that area that I talked about earlier, along with these other remains. And you find labyrinths all over the northern hemisphere, and right down into the Native American Indian territories in North America.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is that the classical Cretan pattern is found all over the place. So
yeah, I see you have you're depicting a stone labyrinth in Finland, among other things.
Absolutely, yeah. Because the interesting thing about the whole story of the Cretan labyrinth is that, or the Trojan labyrinth, the labyrinths are often referred to as Troy towns, and that's usually explained. The usual explanation is that the city of Troy somehow had the character of a labyrinth, or was...
Interesting, they say the same about Atlantis.
Oh, really? Oh, yeah.
Well, the concentric circles, at least.
Yes.
But obviously, if you're going to sail through concentric circles, you need entrances.
Yeah. But in fact, I think a more likely explanation is that the story of Troy is in fact symbolic. It's a symbolic story about the freeing of the spring goddess from winters. Helen of Troy being the spring goddess. So the Greeks or the Spartans go in and rescue her. Now you get the name, you get variations of the name Troy all over the place, all over Europe. So I think it's actually more likely that the name Troy or Troya is actually a name for winter. It actually means winter.
Interesting.
Yeah,
I've been to the alleged Troy. You
have?
Yeah, yes, which is now located in western Turkey next to Izmir.
Right. Yes.
And they have a huge wooden horse there.
Oh, right. Yes. Yes.
Like a reconstruction, right? Because they've been excavating. But,
one theory is that the horse wasn't in fact a horse, but it was a ship.
Right.
But we don't...
I mean, Viking ships have heads like that. But if Troy was a common word, then and like you said elsewhere, and probably also in your book, you said that it's more likely that the place names comes from the myth rather than the opposite.
Exactly.
Right.
Yes.
And then this Troy may just have been commemorating the myth.
Yeah.
And either way, I think there will be, I mean, you don't have to be advanced to realize that, hey, here's a wooden structure. There may be soldiers inside. I mean, it's kind of ludicrous.
Yeah, it is a bit. Yeah.
I would guillotine my soldiers if they didn't examine the inside of such a structure.
Yes. Yeah, well, of course, the Vikings often referred to a ship as the horse of the sea.
Right.
So it could well have been a ship.
Which they would need if it was an island in the north. Now, You also depict an interesting map. One of them are from Mercator, I think.
Oh, yes.
I've seen many ancient maps which depict huge anomalies. I mean, they follow the traditional stuff, and then suddenly they introduce an anomaly, especially in the north.
Yes.
So could we use maps as evidence for something here?
Well, possibly. I mean, that map was done by Mercator at second or third hand, I think. So I don't think we can place much reliance on it. I mean, it shows what purports to be the North Pole, a sort of a lake at the North Pole with an island in the middle, and 4 rivers which go into this lake. But as I say, it was built on Mercator's reading of descriptions of the North, probably second hand from Pythias. So I don't know.
But we have very many ancient maps, even Chinese maps, all over the world actually, that depicts interesting tidbits that they shouldn't be able to. Very famous one, of course, is Piri Reis, the Turkish admiral.
Ah, yes. That of course that is fascinating, because that appears to show it does show the coast of Antarctica underneath the ice. So how could the people who made that map have known what the coastline looked like?
Exactly. I think it's in the 60s we discovered it through echo. What's it called? Right.
Yes.
Yeah. And logic just says, okay, if the South Pole was dry at some point, then obviously also the North Pole.
Yes.
That goes without saying.
That is logical. Yes.
So there are stuff there. Now, in your book, you're talking about something that many people are not very aware of, and me included, actually, and that's the Russian revival, I guess.
Oh, yes. Well,
how will you account for this?
Well,
what's going on there?
This is something that fascinates me a great deal, because I've studied Russian, and I'm very fond of the Russian language, and I've been to Russia, and I love Russia, actually. I'm a great Russophile. And I'm very fascinated by what's going on in Russia right now, because in the wake of communism, there's a great spiritual revival and a great spiritual search going on. Because during the communist years, spirituality was more or less suppressed. And now it's all coming up again. And there's a great spiritual hunger. And they're looking in different directions. There's been a huge return to the Russian Orthodox Church, and there are thousands of churches being built all over the place with full congregations. Other Russians are turning to things like the Roerich movement, anthroposophy, theosophy, and New Age, and so on. And there's another group that is turning back to the pre-Christian pagan traditions of Russia. This is also a very vibrant movement. So all of this I find very fascinating, and there's a kind of a neo-Hyperborean movement which is part of this. And this has given rise to artists and writers who have taken up this Hyperborean theme. I've mentioned this in the book. There are a series of remarkable paintings of showing Hyperborean cities and people in sleighs being drawn by mammoths and enormous ports with ships coming and going. And so all this is extremely fascinating. And it's also been, as I said, taken up in fiction. There are a number of novels dealing with this Hyperborean theme, and archaeologists who are continuing to explore the region in northern Russia next to the Arctic.
So they are actually doing new excavations in those areas now?
Oh, yes, they're doing new excavations, and they've come up with new discoveries. So all this is most interesting, I find.
So they're actually deliberately looking for evidence of Hyperborean civilization, and they are discovering stuff.
I think they are, yes. Yes.
That's most interesting. Is this also connected to the political side of it, or is it not necessarily a connection there? Because we know the extreme right wing often, well, some would say hijack these traditions.
There is a nationalistic element, yes, in this. It's not. I don't think it's typical or central to this movement, but yes, it's there, I would say.
Yeah, because if you look at Iceland, because unfortunately, I mean, many Americans, and half our audience are American. Many Americans have a very romantic view of Scandinavia, and especially Norway. I think that we are more or less directly. I mean, we are direct descendants of Vikings, but they imagine that if you go to a remote Norwegian village, you'll find some ancient tradition. Now, there are small pockets of survival in terms of family traditions and other stuff that has to have cloaked itself in Christianity to survive. But for the most part, Norway is disconnected from its tradition, and Black Plague had lots to do with it.
Oh, yeah.
But even before the Black Plague, we were struggling.
Yeah.
Now, if you go further north to the Finnish people are not, unlike many people think that Finnish people are the same as the Scandinavians, but they're not. They are actually a Turkic people.
Oh, yes.
And their language, I mean, originally, and the language is also different. But they still have similarities in their spirituality, especially the shamanic aspect.
Yeah.
And then you have the Lapps or the Samis. I actually have an ex-girlfriend who was a Sami Nuaida.
Really?
Which is, that's a shaman. And they have managed to preserve. But if you go to Iceland, you will find a much better survival of the tradition than you can ever dream of. And there it's not baked into politics so much. And I think it's because if you have been suppressed and you are reviving something, then you come from a point of complexity. You feel inferior and you want to grasp back to the proudness, right? But if you've never been bothered with,
yes,
like Icelandic, you don't have that need to prove anything, right? You know it's okay. And even their Christian period was by choice, unlike us.
Well, their arm was twisted to become Christian.
Pardon?
Their arm was twisted. They had their arm twisted to become Christian, because the Norwegian king threatened to kill or maim all Icelanders in Norway unless Iceland converted. So what they did?
Yeah, but I would argue twisting the arm is much better than having your head chopped off. We became Christians by this word.
Yeah. Yes. Well, it was an Icelandic priest who made the decision. They gave him the decision to make: should we become Christian or not? And he decided, yes, okay, we'll become Christian, provided that people in private can go on worshipping the old gods. So yes, you could say it was a choice.
Very, very pragmatical. It reminds me of the Khazars.
The Khazars.
Yeah. Very pragmatical choice of transforming the tradition.
It was, yes.
And my point is, despite cloaking a lot of stuff in Christianity, the connection with the earth in Iceland and with the tradition is much more vibrant there. Yeah,
it is, yes. And of course you have the whole poetic tradition, and you have the literature, the Eddas and the sagas. So it's all there, and also in folk traditions like the belief in the elves and so on.
Yeah.
So it's very much part of the air you breathe in Iceland.
Yeah, you will find people who are seriously devotees. I mean, you will find it in Norway too, but that's due to a revival in the 60s or something. Yeah. But like Bifrost, I can give a shout out to them. Bifrost, which is the Norse religion society.
Yes.
Yeah. But in Iceland, you will find people who have had living traditions, especially through families. Like you said, it was in private.
Yeah.
So, and I believe there's an Icelander also who has written the foreword to your book.
Hilmar Örn Hilmarsson. Yes, he is a very old friend of mine. He is now Asherjagodi. He's head of the pagan community in Iceland, the Asatru Fellowship. And it's a very vibrant and growing community. They have now, I think, over 4,000 members in a country of, about just over 300,000. So it's quite a large percentage of the population. And the members include some quite influential people. They include politicians, journalists, university professors. So it's not a kind of alternative hippie kind of thing. It's quite mainstream, actually. So yes.
Yeah, we both have friends in that network.
Yeah.
Okay, so that covers Iceland. Before we go over to your almost a CV, is there any other things you want to speak about or address that you are touching in the book? Again, I haven't read it, so I'm limited in how much I can extract and squeeze out of you. But I want to say this. Lots of famous authors have been bragging about the book, because I see here quotes from Jocelyn Goodwin that we have mentioned,
yes.
Arthur's Verslus,
yes.
Herbie Brannan.
Yes.
I have books by all those guys, and even Tobias Churton.
Yes.
But is there anything or other aspects of this we should touch?
I think we've covered it pretty well.
Okay, so then we could move to other books you've made. Obviously, we're not going to discuss them, but they need a shout out. What was the first book you published? Was that Eliphas Levi and the occult?
No, it was a book on astrology, history of astrology, called The Astrologers and Their Creed.
Right, that's a classic, yes. I never read it, but I've seen it around. Is astrology featured in the Nordic tradition?
Good question.
I mean, some sort of astrology. I don't expect it to be identical to the one practiced today, but shouldn't it be if they have structures pointing to astronomical phenomenons?
Well, if you consider the mythology around the Great Bear to be astrological, yes. I go into that in the book, the significance of the bear, the Great Bear.
Yeah, because the Russians are big on the bear, are they not?
Yes, and I think that's no coincidence that the bear is sort of the symbolic animal of Russia.
But you know the Neanderthals, they were worshipping bears.
Were they?
They were. We know now, of course, they were much more advanced than we've given them credit for.
Yeah.
In fact, they were just like any other tribe. But central in their religion was the bear.
Yes.
And now there are those who think that we are all Homo sapiens, yes. But the interesting thing is that the Europeans seems to be mixed in with Neanderthal. The Asians with the Denisovans. And then they thought that African people, black south of Sahara, they thought that, they were just Homo sapiens because they had neither. But now they have found a third ancient anthropological strain. I forgot what they call it. But which is specific to them. So it seems that we all have a common Homo sapiens heritage, and then we've been mixed in with different local ancient tribes. And if the Neanderthals are bear worshipping, it kind of indicates that they must have had some kind of connection to an ancient Nordic tradition then. I mean, it's a stretch, but it's not outrageous.
Yeah, well, I mean the word bear in Greek is arctos, hence the name Arctic.
Oh, I thought it was ursa, but that may be Latin.
That's the Latin, ursa, ursa major.
Yeah, right.
But the Greek is Arctos, which is why the region is called the Arctic. And you also get variations of it in, for example, the name Arthur, King Arthur.
Right.
Because the bear was considered a kind of epitome of strength and courage.
Values which have been held high by these cultures.
Yes.
That's interesting. So, so your first book was on astrology. But I guess when you lived in Britain, you went that into esoterica. That was later.
Oh, I was.
Oh, you were?
Oh, no. Okay. Oh, yeah. I mean, from my early 20s.
Ah, okay.
I mean, my astrology book came out when I was only 25. And so...
and I see the Eliphas Levi book was written in 72?
Published in
72?
Published in 72, yes. Oh, yeah, so I've been interested in these things since my undergraduate days, basically. And I've been involved actively in certain things. I started off with more or less a kind of scholarly interest in these things, but then I wanted to become more actively involved, and I took part in various groups.
It pulls you in, doesn't it?
It pulls you in. So I was
in known groups?
Well, I was in one particular group which was practicing a kind of a Golden Dawn type of magic.
Servants of the Light, maybe?
No, not Servants of the Light, although I knew people in Servants of the Light. But no, it was a small group. It's actually, I don't know if do you know Tanya Luhrmann's book?
Doesn't ring a bell, no.
Well, she's an American anthropologist who wrote her doctorate at Cambridge on magical groups in England. Oh, and one of the groups that I was involved in. So in her book, I'm actually mentioned under another name. But anyway, so I have...
You have to protect your academic...
Probably, yes. Yeah. So I was involved in that kind of Golden Dawn type of magic for a while. But then over a longer period, I moved over to the pagan tradition.
Yeah, because that would be my guess.
Yeah.
Because of your current interests.
Yes. So during the course of writing that astrology book, I came into contact with the whole domain of the esoteric traditions as a whole. And I discovered that Eliphas Levi was an important figure in the Western esoteric tradition. So I decided to write a book about Levi and his age. So it starts around the end of the 18th century and goes on to the early 20th century with Levi as the main sort of central focus of the book. So that was my second book. And then I went on to write a book on the Rosicrucians, which was originally published as the Rosy Cross Unveiled.
Yeah, I have both versions, actually.
Oh, right, yes. And then I published another book on the Rosicrucians called The Rose Cross and the Age of Reason, which is actually based on my doctoral thesis.
Yeah, have that one too.
You have that as well. Then some of my other books, a biography of King Ludwig II of Bavaria, which is not particularly esoteric, but he's a figure who has always fascinated me. And my book is basically the most thorough biography in English of him.
Interesting. Okay.
Yes. Another subject that has always interested me is horticulture, and in particular the sacred and symbolic dimensions of garden design. So another book of mine is called Gardens of the Gods, which is an examination of sacred and symbolic gardens at different traditions and in different parts of the world and different periods.
Oh, interesting. I knew agriculture was closely tied to spirituality, but even gardening. Yes,
more the iconographic and symbolic aspects of garden design.
Okay.
The layout of the garden, the statuary, the associations, the mythological associations of the plants, and so on, and so
the
on.
feng shui of gardens.
Feng shui comes into it as well.
Right,
yes.
Right.
So that was another book I wrote, and also I, to some extent, practice what I preach, because my wife and I have a garden here.
Oh, it's so British.
So, it's a very British activity, yes, gardening.
Yeah. Like the hobbits, you know.
Yes. Yeah. So,
but you also wrote a fiction, haven't you?
I've written fiction. I've written 3 volumes of short stories and an esoteric novel called Return of the Tetrad.
I've been eyeing that book because of the title, so I was going to ask you. So tell us, what's that about?
Return of the Tetrad is shall we say, it's the narrator of the story is very loosely based on myself as a young man. He's a young journalist called Paul Cairns, who comes into contact with a sort of guru figure who's called Gilbert North in the book.
North.
Gilbert North.
Yeah.
Who is an initiate of a magical order. And he initiates this young guy into the magical order. And the story involves a quest for 4 objects, which correspond to the 4 suits of the tarot. A wand, a sword, a pentacle, and one
wand, sword, pentacle, and cup.
And cup, yes, exactly. So the story involves the idea that these 4 objects existed at one point in Britain and were dispersed, and the task is to bring them together again. And all kinds of adventures occur along the way. The story itself is fantasy, but the central character, as I say, is loosely based on myself at that time, and the Gilbert North character is based on somebody I knew. So some of it is very sort of over the top. There are magical battles and things like that. So it's quite over the top.
So it sounds like it could be made into a movie then.
Oh, that would be great if it were made into a movie.
But is there also a spiritual aspect to it? Like, it's not just Harry Potter. I suspect you're injecting it with esoteric lore.
Oh yes, absolutely. Yes. It has.
I can see that from the title.
Yeah, and it has a serious message. So that,
like Churton said, there can be more truths in fiction than in many facts in so-called non-fiction books.
Oh yeah, he's pretty articulate. Yeah.
Yeah. And loves to talk.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I start off the novel with quote from it's a Sufi saying. I'll just read it. It says, "Take a lie, a myth, and a fact, and you get somewhere near the truth."
Brilliant. Who is that quoting?
It's not attributed to any particular person. It's just a Sufi saying.
Adage, right.
Yeah.
It's a brilliant one. I haven't heard that one, but I'll start using it.
Right.
So and I have to say, your Rosicrucian books, I can actually opinionate about them because I read them. I'll say the Rosicrucian and Age of Reason is more in-depth in a way.
Yes.
Whereas the Rosicrucian history, mythical, and rituals of an order, it's a good introduction to the history of Rosicrucianism. But I'd say in terms of the experienced reader, I'd rather go for Eliphas Levi and the French Occult Revival or the Rosicrucian and Age of Reason.
Yes. Well, there's another book of mine I should mention called The Lebensborn Spy, which is not at all esoteric. It's a spy thriller. Yes, but there is one slight, one slight element in it from the Nordic mythology, because there's a particular figure there's a particular Nordic god who appears at certain points in the book, but only the very informed reader will spot that. But
they describe it as George Orwell meets John le Carré.
Yes, that was Herbie Brennan who said that.
Sounds like a book I should get my mother. She's into spy spy novels?
Well, it's set at the time of the Cold War,
Right.
Partly in Germany and partly in Denmark.
All right. Is the Odessa featuring here?
No. It has to do with it's based on historical facts, which it has to do with the Lebensborn project, which was a series. It was a chain of maternity and children's homes run by the Nazi SS, partly for the children of women in the occupied countries who had become pregnant by German soldiers and wanted to give their children away to avoid the stigma.
Yeah.
And after the war, some of these children ended up in East Germany, and the East German intelligence service hit on the idea of using them as spies, sending them back.
That's like the Ottomans did with the Janissaries, kind of.
Yes.
They exploit that weakness because they can be shaped and formed. They have no roots, like.
Right. Yeah.
So it's so sinister, but it's brilliant.
Very
I didn't know this.
Yeah, very sinister.
So the Stasi used them, recruited them, and reused them.
Well, I don't know whether it was the Stasi or another branch. In my story, it's the Stasi.
Okay.
But they then found that most of these people were so traumatized by the Lebensborn experience that they weren't suitable as spies.
So backfired.
Yes, but they then started getting their agents to masquerade as these ex-Lebensborn inmates. And my story is based on one particular case where it was actually a Norwegian case where a Stasi agent went to Norway, made contact with the woman he claimed to be his mother, and she hadn't seen him since he was a baby. So she accepted him as her son, and he was accepted by the whole family, taken into the family.
Oh my God, that's so evil! Yeah.
Yeah, and he then started spying activities for East Germany. Then came the fall of the wall and the reunification, and he was exposed. And of course, it was a tragic thing because the family felt betrayed.
Yeah, and they had a relation with him and everything then.
Yes, and even more tragic was that the real son. By the time the real son heard about this, the mother had died. So anyway, my story is loosely based on this case.
Well, it sounds like a great plot, I have to say. I mean, just a real life story is interesting.
Yeah.
Notwithstanding when you start spinning up on it.
Well, it involves one character who's based on this spy that I just talked about. But there's another character. There's a parallel story of another man growing up in East Berlin, and there's a connection between these two, which is worked out in a suspenseful way during the course of the story. So,
all right.
If you read it, I hope you'll enjoy it.
Well, I think I should give it as I'm going to get it and give it to my mother.
She'll very good.
Enjoy it. So, yeah, because the return of the Tetrad, it reminds me in the wake of, I guess, Da Vinci Code, but also other books that it's been a flood of books coming when they realized, esoterica can be used in fiction.
Yeah, yes.
Novel.
Yeah.
I mean, Bulwer-Lytton knew that, but that's a long time ago.
Yes.
And so I also know that, you have the Rule of Four, I think, was the book that came.
Yes.
And,
yes.
Right. So, and then Goodwin wrote the real Rule of Four.
Yes. Yes.
And you have also books, the real Da Vinci Code, etc. So I guess that follows in the footprints of that more modern wave of esoteric novels.
Yeah, yeah. I think you also might enjoy my 3 volumes of short stories.
What's that called?
There's one of them is called Master of the Starlit Grove. Master of the Starlit Grove. And there are several stories in it, but the one of that title deals with the concept of the Egregore, which is a a kind of collective thought form on the etheric plane, created by many people thinking the same thoughts and focusing on the same symbols. And the idea in my story is that there was a pagan egregore that was created at the time of the conversion to Christianity to act as a kind of ark to preserve the pagan religion,
right,
for the time when Christianity would retreat and paganism could reappear. So that's the basic theme of that story. And then,
but that's a very interesting concept in and by itself.
Yes, well, I sort of believe in the existence of egregores.
I mean, if we want to use a more modern language, because this is from the magical, mythical language, but if you want to, we could say that, Rupert Sheldrake,
yes,
he's talking about field consciousness, and so I think and Jung has touched this with archetypes, right?
Yes.
I think there's a connection here, because they say, for example, in Esoterica, they say that groups who work with the same ideas kind of develop egregore. It doesn't even have to be religious or spiritual. Any kind of group really has its egregore.
Well, even a football crowd.
Yes, although I would hate to think what the effects of that egregore would be. Hooligan egregore, but
or say a political rally, a crowd at a political rally.
Right, good point.
Or even a political party.
And maybe a family even.
Yeah, a family, certainly, yes. Oh, yes.
And I think that if you do have a dormant egregore, you only need some keys to reconnect with it, so to speak.
That's right.
Which I believe would be symbolism, be found in symbols.
Symbols, yes.
And maybe also actions, rituals.
Actions, even certain words, expressions.
And maybe certain sound frequencies too.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, now we're touching deeper stuff than mere history. But no, this is a very interesting concept. So you play around with that in a story.
Yes, there's the story Master of the Starlit Grove. And then I have two other collections of short stories. One is called The Weird Garden, with The Weird Garden and Other Strange Tales. Weird spelt W-Y-R-D-E. W-Y-R-D.
Oh, okay.
And then there's another collection called The Sorceress of Agartha.
Brilliant. Oh, there's Agartha again.
Yes.
But just backtracking to egregore, I believe that, I don't believe, but in magic, ceremonial magic, they work even with invoking egregores. And then they became apparitions.
Yes.
Well, maybe that can explain why so many god forms are anthropomorphed or even represented as animals. That these energies take these shapes.
Yes. Well, there's the German group Fraternitas Saturni, who I think used the concept of the egregore.
They did.
Yeah. Well, I think these egregores do exist. I think they have some similarity to Jung's archetypes, but it's more like an archetype that is created. It can be these egregores can be quite short-lived, whereas Jung's archetypes are permanent.
Yeah, perennial.
Yeah,
but I think that could be like levels of egregores. That the deeper they are, the longer they have existed, the more universal they become.
Yes.
Like a hooligan egregore is probably short-lived, but
yes.
But if you talk about, like, say, the Nordic gods, then they have been around for a while. I mean, other gods too, of course. But if someone like dreams of a god meet a god in a dream, for example, and get a revelation. So many people think they meet Jesus, right?
Yes, that's true. Yes.
And that's a very powerful energy in our time and day, which is completely disconnected from the historic or even the original Christians.
Yeah, that's
the modern Jesus, I mean.
Yes. Well, Jung has an interesting simile in one of his essays where he says that a god is like a river, and it may be that the source of the river dries up and then the river disappears. But then when the water starts to flow again, it returns to the original riverbed and the river is there again. So I think this is what is happening with the pagan gods today.
It's a brilliant metaphor.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes.
It just struck me, Chris, that, I heard another interview with you where you mentioned that you're the guy with the preface to your book.
Yeah.
He said he had met a god. It just struck me that may be what we were just talking about, that he actually encountered an embodiment of an egregore.
Well, I think you're thinking of Svenborn, the founder of the Asatru movement.
Oh, it was the founder, okay, not the guy who wrote.
Yes,
okay.
I think it was Svenbjørn Benteinsen who said that he had actually met Odin on one occasion when he was out for a walk in the country.
And where else would that egregore manifest than in Iceland, right? You'd be hard-pressed to find Odin in Egypt, for example.
Exactly, yes. Yes. Well, this is another thing that I feel about paganism, that it's essentially local. As you say, you wouldn't find Odin in Egypt. So the paganism is.
So it's connected to the land, space.
It's connected to the land, to the local traditions, the local mythology, the language that has evolved in a particular region, the customs, and all of that.
And probably the energy of the land.
The energy of the land as well.
Ley lines and stuff.
All of that, yes.
Mm-hmm. But then we have an interesting phenomenon when we see that many gods are similar. Let's say, take a classical, let's say Tooth in Egypt becomes Hermes in Greek, becomes Mercury.
Yes. Yeah.
Maybe Loki in Norse. I'm not sure who he would be in Norse. But then you could say that we are talking archetypes, because then they just have different masks, different.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then we're like astrology. Then we're talking about universal energies that we are just conceiving differently.
Yeah.
In our inception of them.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yes.
Well, interesting. Okay, before we bid you adieu, I wanna. You've been involved in some very noteworthy things. For example, Exeter.
Yes.
Where you've been working. Was it the first university? No, Sorbonne was probably the first, but it's one of the very early ones with esoteric.
Yes. Well, I think the Sorbonne was the first program. That was at a branch of the Sorbonne called the École Pratique des Hautes Études, which was the original. I think I'm right in saying it was started by a man called François Secret. I think he was the first professor, and then Antoine Fèvre became the professor. But that was a graduate program at the Sorbonne. Then later on came the program at Amsterdam University, headed by Wouter Hanegraaff. You probably know his work.
Yeah, famous.
Yeah, and then came our program at Exeter. But what was different about the Exeter program was that it was a distance learning program. So
anyone could partake?
Basically, anyone who could show that they were sufficiently qualified could take part, yes. So the students weren't resident at Exeter. They came actually from all over the world. We had people who came from far and wide. There was one woman who came from Alaska.
Wow.
Another came from Canada. Someone came from Sweden. One came from Romania. So they came from all over the place to these weekend seminars, about 3 seminars a year. And for these people, it was a unique opportunity. It was the only possibility for them to study the Western esoteric tradition in depth.
Must have been an interesting egregore you evoked there.
I think we did, yes.
But did you also use digital tools like webcam and email and stuff like that?
We used email a lot, and the telephone. The student would have a supervisor, and every so often the supervisor would talk on the phone to the student.
When did you erect this in Exeter?
It was about, about 2005 or 6.
So that's why you could partake as a professor, even though you lived in Germany at the time.
Yeah. No, let's see. Nicholas Goodrich Clark died in 2012. So it was. It would have been around 2006 or 7 that the program was.
And he's the one who initiated this.
Yes. Yeah, he initiated it, and he was a very vital and charismatic and energetic figure. And
obviously many famous books like, for example, The Occult Roots of Nazism is a classic.
Exactly, yes.
And I also noticed that his wife is writing spiritual books.
Oh, yes, Claire, yes. She was also part of the program. But so it was a great tragedy when he died very suddenly and very unexpectedly.
Did that ruin the study?
Yes, it did really, because the university somehow, I think they had sort of lost interest in the project, and when he died, I think they sort of, I think the momentum went out of it, basically.
Yeah, because Tobias Churton was expressed profound disappointment because he saw the potentiality.
Yeah.
And was very, very annoyed with the university.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it was a great pity. Yeah. There are universities in other parts of the world, in the States, for example, where some courses are dealing with esoteric subjects, but under other headings like comparative religion or...
Yeah, because Goodwin never... there was never an esoteric... I mean, he has written a million esoteric books, but always under the guise of other subject fields like music or history.
Yes. Well, he was professor of music at Colgate University.
And yet he wrote books about Atlantis and whatnot.
Exactly, yes. Yes.
So, okay, but it's an interesting part of modern academic history. And it doesn't exist anymore, does it? Or is there some remnant of it at Exeter?
No, it's completely folded up.
It's gone.
Unfortunately.
Okay. Too bad. And lastly, you said you were involved in UN. What did you do there?
Oh, well, I worked in New York for 4 years for the United Nations Development Program. I was doing publications work. I was editor of a magazine on development projects and traveling all around the world, reporting on those projects.
But that's, I mean, what's your field academically? Isn't that history?
Yes, basically my doctorate was in history. Yeah.
So what does that have to do with...
Well, what happened was I was married to an American woman, and that was, around the late 1980s. And we decided that we wanted to go into the academic world. So we were living in England at the time, and I went back to Oxford, where I'd been an undergraduate, and did a doctorate. That was my second Rosicrucian book. My then wife did a doctorate at the Royal College of Art in London. And then we went to the States, That was 1989, with the intention of finding academic positions. But instead, I ended up working for the United Nations.
All right.
Because I'd arrived at the wrong time of year to apply for academic jobs. So I looked around for something else to do in the meantime. And through a connection, I ended up working for the UN, which turned out to be, in the first place, a lot better paid than academic positions.
Of course.
And
Anything is paid better than academic positions.
yeah. And in some ways a lot more interesting. So I had a very interesting 4 years.
Because you could travel a lot?
Oh yeah, I traveled all over the world.
So you've been all over the north then?
I've been all over the third world and both.
What about Russia? You've been
Oh yes, I've been to Russia. Yes.
Scandinavia?
Yes. Scandinavia. I've been to I've been to all the Scandinavian countries.
And Iceland, I assume.
And Iceland, yes. And well, so then my job at the UN in New York came to an end, and I moved back to England. By that time, my marriage had come unstuck. I moved back to London, and within a couple of months, I'd found a job in Hamburg with the UNESCO. So I moved to Hamburg, and I've been in Germany ever since. So, but for my working life, I've had two careers, because you can't live on writing esoteric books.
No.
So I had to have a job.
You can hardly live on writing books per se. So
That's right, yes. So, but now I'm retired from UNESCO, so now I can concentrate on writing and doing the things that really interest me.
And you paid your due to Germany as a German citizen with the Lebensborn Spy and the Swan King.
Yes, absolutely. I hope so, yes.
So do you have any books in the pipeline?
Well, yes, I'm writing something at the moment which is related to the Northern tradition. But I don't want to say too much about it at the moment because it's in a very embryonic stage.
Yeah, that's normal. All the authors we interview say that. So we know, we accept that.
Yeah.
But that's cool. So you're following up on that Arctos thread. So
well,
to speak.
it's a different sort of approach. Hopefully it'll be published one day.
But is the subject field history or is it more spirituality?
It's more. How shall I describe it? It's kind of personal reflections, thoughts and reflections, but related to the Nordic tradition.
Right, I got you. Well, I'm looking forward to that one.
Good.
Whenever it is completed, we can have you back then, and
by all means, yes.
See your take on it. But it's been brilliant to converse with you today.
Yes, my pleasure.
That's good.
But as long as you're happy with the content.
Oh yeah, it's good.
Well, it's been very interesting talking to you.
Ditto.
So let's keep in touch.
Yep, let's do.
And hope to see you here sometime.
You may very well. And by the way, it goes the other way too if you're in Norway.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, well, have a good evening.
Yes, you too.
Yeah, bye for now.
Bye. So much for today. Now, if you enjoyed this topic, I could recommend another book except for Arctos and Chris's own Hyperborea book, namely one by Dr. Peter Kingsley that was mentioned in the show, and the book called A Story Waiting to Pierce You. This is basically about a very famous Hyperborean, the high priest Abaris. And you'll hear his take on it, but it's a great book and you read it in less than a day. Now, remember people, we are still far too small in terms of listenership compared to our potential. And it hasn't helped that YouTube is quenching any independent media's possibility to grow organically. So if you listened to just one of our shows, no matter, never mind, you're off the hook. But if you have listened to at least two of our shows, I implore you to share them and to spread our shows. Now, of course, one thing is to just randomly share it on social media, but if there's a specific topic, someone who's interested in that, send them the link to that show. That's the best way to spread. Because although it's better than nothing, just randomly sharing on Facebook, for example, doesn't have that great of an impact. But sharing is very important. It helps the algorithm to squeeze out of the algorithm at least a little backing. And I've noticed that here and there some people have mentioned us, and we appreciate that, either if it's on Reddit or Face or Twitter or whatever. So we hope you continue to do that. It's so important to put us on the map. There's so many guests that never get back to us because they have no idea who we are. We could have so many great guests on if we just grew a little bigger. And growth has really been quenched the last years because of the rigging of the system after the big corporations took over YouTube and others. And they say, well, why don't you get onto other places like BitChute? Well, first off, we are already on all podcasts, and a public secret is that we have more shows out on the podcast channel than we have on YouTube, although YouTube is our main scene and will still be. You remember, it takes a lot of time and energy to make a YouTube video. Even if it's just these stills, that we still are tied to the mast of a certain way to do it that's time consuming. But podcasts don't require anything else than just audio. So that's why we flushed a lot more shows out on our podcast channel. So if you you don't have to go to Podbean, which we have chosen, because you will find us, of course, at Google Podcast, Spotify, iTunes, or Apple, or whatever they're all called. So subscribe to us on the podcast channels too if you use that format. That also helps us. Now, I am considering Minds, even BitShit, but I'm kind of annoyed with BitShit because they let any random person steal shows that take from original content creators like ourselves, upload it there, monetize it, and BitShit doesn't care even when we complain. So they are going too far in the opposite direction of YouTube. They're representing two polarities, if you like. But we'll see what we have resources to do. We may expand, but more importantly than us expanding to many platforms is you making us expand by liking our shows, that helps, and sharing them, of course. I'll read you a quote as customary before we part. It goes like this. Let us face ourselves. We are Hyperboreans. We know very well how far off we live. Neither by land nor by sea will you find a way to the Hyperboreans. Pindar already knew this about us. Beyond the north, ice and death, our life, our happiness. We have discovered happiness, we know the way. We have found the exit out of the labyrinth of thousands of years. Said none other than Friedrich Nietzsche. That's it. Thanks for staying with us. As always, I've been your host, Al. Thanks to your faithful support and my tireless teeth. Be seeing you.
Who is number one?